Good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's program, what I'm sure will be a stimulating and thought-provoking event to discuss the troubling issues of what we've called conflict minerals, child soldiers, and Canadian responses. The use of child soldiers is an international problem affecting hundreds of thousands of young people around the world. We've heard of it in, of course, places like Sierra Leone, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but it's reported in many other countries as well. Afghanistan, Myanmar or Burma, Colombia, Yemen, Nepal, Thailand. These are countries that Canada has strong connections to. These are countries where Canada does business, in the extraction industry, for example, and where other companies based in Canada have to source their minerals. I'll bet everybody in this room has a smartphone of some kind or other with minerals in it that come from these countries. Tonight we have two very distinguished Canadians, leading advocates in the fight to eradicate child soldiers and the fight to resolve the issue of blood minerals. My name's Paul Schabas. I'm a bencher at the Law Society, and I'm the chair of the Law Society's Human Rights Monitoring Group, and I'll be moderating this event. I'd like to thank the Canadian Lawyers for International Human Rights for organizing it. The Law Society is very proud to co-host this event with that organization and look to its efforts to strengthen human rights efforts. The Law Society of Upper Canada has a duty to maintain and advance the cause of justice and the rule of law. We're delighted to be able to present tonight's program as part of our mandate to uphold the rule of law. One aspect of the rule of law is, of course, the rule and the protection of human rights and international human rights. While we are still quaintly known as the Law Society of Upper Canada, we recognize that upholding the rule of law and protecting human rights is something that requires us to look beyond our borders, to look around the world, and we see that as a key part of our role, our statutory role in protecting the rule of law. I'm proud to chair the Law Society's Human Rights Monitoring Group, which was established in 2006. It has collaborated with organizations such as Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International in support of the role of the legal profession and the judiciary abroad. We've prepared more than 70 letters of intervention to government officials, from Vladimir Putin to Hu Jintao to Hugo Chavez, among others, expressing the Law Society's concerns over the treatment of human rights lawyers and members of the judiciary. And we've issued more than 40 public statements condemning the mistreatment of lawyers and judges, and in some cases called on governments to reinstate the rule of law. In 2007, I believe, we organized what we called a gathering to protest. We have to call it a gathering, not a protest. We organized a gathering to protest the removal of the Chief Justice of Pakistan. We're proud of our work, and we're extremely pleased that some of our efforts have helped to achieve positive outcomes, such as the recent conditional release of Judge Maria Lourdes Afiuni of Venezuela. Judge Afiuni was imprisoned and then placed under house arrest simply because her decision in a particular case was contrary to the views of the Venezuelan authorities. And our intervention was front-page news in Venezuela. Raising our concerns can have an impact, and we'll continue to speak out against abuses against lawyers and judges when advocating for basic human rights. We believe it is important that legal and human rights organizations continue to increase awareness of human rights issues, and we hope today's discussion will generate ideas on how we all can continue to play a role in bringing greater justice and security to those whose rights are threatened. I'd like now to call on Juda Strawczynski, the president of the Canadian Lawyers for Human Rights, to introduce the event, the topic, and our guest speakers. Juda?
Thanks, Paul. General Roméo Dallaire, Paul Dewar, Paul Schabas, distinguished benchers, lawyers, and honorable guests. My name is Juda Strawczynski. I'm the president of Canadian Lawyers for International Human Rights, or CLAIHR. Welcome and thank you for joining us for a discussion about conflict minerals, child soldiers, and Canadian responses. Established in 1991, CLAIHR promotes international human rights in part through public legal education events such as this one this evening. Tonight, CLAIHR is honored to partner with Roméo Dallaire's Child Soldier Initiative and the Law Society of Upper Canada. It is particularly fitting that we are holding this event at historic Osgoode Hall. It is home to the Court of Appeal for Ontario and the Law Society of Upper Canada, two independent institutions whose roles are essential to the protection and promotion of the rule of law in Ontario and beyond. Holding this event at Osgoode Hall also serves as a reminder of the fragility of the rule of law. In Osgoode Hall's law library, there is a memorial paying tribute to lawyers who died in the First World War. In the Court of Appeal's main atrium, another statue is dedicated to lawyers who lost their lives in the Second World War. These lawyers gave their ultimate sacrifice when the rule of law faced its most severe threats. Many of our essential international human rights emerged out of these two world wars. Our Charter of Rights and Freedoms was built on many of those international human rights principles. The struggle for the protection of international human rights and the promotion and protection of the rule of law continues today. But today's challenges are as daunting, if not more so than ever. As our distinguished presenters will describe in greater detail, the allure and importance of natural resources, coupled with disregard for the rule of law in certain conflict areas, has led to children being conscripted into militias. Tonight's discussion, which will focus on the connections between conflict minerals, the evils of the use of child soldiers, and their connections to Canada, will no doubt serve as a stark reminder of the importance of the rule of law and the need for constant protection and promotion of international human rights. We look forward to hearing about the experiences of our distinguished panelists, retired Lieutenant General Roméo Dallaire and NDP Foreign Affairs critic Paul Dewar. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guests. Each of our panelists has, in his own way, confronted the moral, legal, and political issues around conflict minerals, the use of child soldiers, and what Canadians can do to stop both. Lieutenant General Roméo Dallaire is a well-known Canadian humanitarian and human rights advocate. As we all know, while the commander of the United Nations Assistance Mission in Rwanda, he bore witness to the genocide of more than 800,000 people in the course of 100 days, which he documented in his award-winning book, Shake Hands with the Devil. Through his support for the doctrine of responsibility to protect and tireless advocacy efforts, he works to prevent similar mass atrocities from occurring. He is also a leading advocate on behalf of child soldiers. His book, They Fight Like Soldiers, They Die Like Children, and the documentary of the same name, expose the phenomenon of the use of child soldiers. His foundation, tonight's partner, Child Soldier Initiative, is dedicated to the eradication of the use of child soldiers by focusing on prevention as well as research and advocacy. Paul Dewar, Member of Parliament for Ottawa Centre, is the NDP's Foreign Affairs critic. In this capacity, he has rallied public support for legislation designed in part to prevent the use of child soldiers in the Great Lakes region of Africa. This initiative follows many years of public service and work on behalf of children. Thank you both for being here today. Tonight's speakers will not only describe the phenomena of conflict minerals and the recruitment of child soldiers, but will also address Canadian responses. We encourage you all to become part of this response and part of this dialogue. We welcome your contributions online. The hashtag is right here. It's hashtag #EveWithDallaire. For those of you who aren't Twitter-tastic, feel free to post to Facebook, LinkedIn, Pinterest, write your friend, call someone, just get the word out that you are here, let them know what you've learned tonight. CLAIHR is grateful to the Law Society of Upper Canada for supporting this event, to Child Soldier Initiative, and to our distinguished speakers. We also thank the Shangri-La Hotel, as well as our members and individual donors who make CLAIHR events possible. Finally, we again thank you, all of you, for joining us this evening. As the treasurer of the Law Society recently blogged about this event, the fact that so many people have come out for this event tonight is both a testament to our distinguished speakers, but also a clear demonstration of the dedication of lawyers and paralegals in Ontario to the protection and promotion of international human rights and the rule of law. I invite General Dallaire to the podium for his opening remarks. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and very kind of you to come out at this hour. Hopefully you stopped by Tim Hortons to grab a donut before getting here so you don't fall asleep while we're trying to bring forward to you some subjects that are not necessarily always in our day-to-day thought, but will do influence our day-to-day activities. And that being the fact that you are, all of you, armed to the teeth with everything from a iPhone to a, if I can find it, my BlackBerry to an iPad to everything else, because in there you have coltan, and coltan is essential, and we have this great ability to take unethical coltan from Eastern Congo, mined by children, moved through Mombasa in various ways, mixed in with ethical coltan from Australia, and then we all feel comfortable that we're not being bad people, when in fact we should be questioning the sources and why that source is still so much under duress. I am quite honored to share in one way the podium with my colleague Paul Dewar. We have worked together and worked very, very positively together, particularly on another subject, which is genocide prevention and the prevention of mass atrocities, where we created together an all-party parliamentary group on the prevention of mass atrocities to educate, well, that's a big word, to inform parliamentarians on what is happening in regards where mass atrocities, massive abuse of human rights happen, and what should we be doing about it. Now, I am constrained by a few factors here to be able to speak and get my point across. First of all, I'm not speaking in my mother tongue, which is Québécois, or as some of my friends in France would say, 18th century French. Secondly, I'm a retired general. We're very visual people, and without PowerPoint or Keynote, I feel that I don't necessarily, I'm armed to achieve the aim. And thirdly, I only have about 15 minutes, and I must say that a retired general who's an apprentice politician in the Senate, brevity is not my strength. So with all that said, I'm going to try to dissect a bit this subject, and then we hope that the interactions will in fact bring out specifics that might be more particularly of interest to you. The subject's in three components. You've got the extraction industry, or the conflict minerals in particular. You've got child soldiers, and you got Canada. And the question is what of those subjects? I think the first thing is let's identify Canada in this exercise. And Canada was a leading nation in the movement that ultimately got approval in the UN and ratification by over 140 countries of what is called the Optional Protocol on Child Rights in just the year 2000-2001, which essentially says that any youth under the age of 18 is not to be trained, equipped, used in any conflict situation. And should a youth be so employed or recruited, then that youth is to be demobilized, rehabilitated, and reintegrated. And yes, a sort of non-punitive judicial process is recognized as being useful. We ratified it, but we never put it into law. And so those of you who are familiar with some of us who have been working on the Omar Khadr case, we've been able to see the non-movement on that case because it is not in law here in this country. And so I am not as courageous as Paul. I've been dabbling at trying to introduce legislation so that we can put into law that optional protocol, and I have not gotten past many of the discussions with my colleagues in the Senate to be able to move it forward. So we pushed the world and we sold a very appropriate piece of international convention, but we sold it to everybody else and not necessarily to ourselves, except for the fact that in 1998, when negotiations were going on for that, I was the Assistant Deputy Minister of Personnel at National Defense as a 3-star, and I'm the one who negotiated the exception that Canada can use and which is permitted, in which we recruit under the age of 18, but we don't train nor employ in operations. That is to say, those who graduate from grade 11 or 12 at 16 or 17 can be recruited into the military college, and as such can continue their university degree, but do so only on an academic sense and not on a training sense. The reserves also recruit in grade ages 16 or 17 by exception, and again, they cannot be trained or oriented by any operations. It's a bit fiddling with the books, but it is a position that is worthy of us to take another look at. The second element of this is the child soldier. I am the founder of the Child Soldier Initiative, and I fear of saying this, but it's based at Dalhousie University. This morning I lectured at the other Osgood Hall, which is way out in the boondocks somewhere, and had a lovely discussion with the third-year students there on human rights and also on child soldiers. But in the realm of child soldiers, we have seen over the last nearly 30 years, that children armed with weapons, very light weapons, machine guns, AK-47s, that 9-year-olds can use very effectively, or simply used as porters or as reconnaissance, informants and so on, have become not a sort of an adjunct to many of the conflicts around the world. And I say adjunct, not an adjunct, because they're either recruited by nation states in their militaries or recruited by non-state actors, both sides, that we're talking in the order of at any one time about 250,000 around the world. And this is under the age of 18 and often as young as 8 or 9. I have not included in there all the children caught up in the drug wars, particularly in South America and Central America, where if you go into the favelas, I was in Rio 2 years ago, and looking at how the children are used in moving drugs in the slums of Rio alone, they kill on average about 2,000 a year, children, as they move. So we're not talking about them yet, we're still talking about children caught up in conflict. Now, in these children caught up in conflict, they are one of the most sophisticated, low-technology weapons systems of our era. Came to the fore with the conflict in Mozambique when we started to demobilize at the end of the Cold War. The Cold War was ebbing. Lots and lots and lots of light machine guns and weapons became available. In the order of about 600 million at any one time are available. And instead of destroying them, all our good public servants said, hey, the taxpayers have paid for this stuff. It's still good, and these weapons are good for 50, 60, 70 years with little maintenance, and so we sold them off. We didn't destroy them, we sold them off. And so they have become quite available and prevalent throughout the world. And as such, have made the proliferation of small arms and the demographics of many of these countries, where at times you see up to 50% of the population under 18, the marriage of the two ideal for those adults who want to pursue whatever ambition they have, be it from banditry all the way through to actual conflict in a reason-based exercise of trying to achieve their aim. Now, these child soldiers, people haven't been sitting by the wayside and just watching this because there are tens and tens of thousands who either die or severely injured every year. And it's been sustainable. And Gracia Michel, and Nelson Mandela's wife, was very much in the lead of raising it, and the international community got very engaged. And it got engaged in the legal dimension, as I indicated, with the optional protocol, and also in establishing through the International Criminal Court the fact that child soldiers are a crime against humanity. And so the use of children as weapons of war is a crime against humanity. And that's taken some time, but it's there. We finally see a few of the people who have been recruiting them finally in front of the International Criminal Court. The NGO world, the non-government world, has been very active on this dossier. But they've been very active on the tail end of the dossier, meaning they've been very active in the picking up the demobilized children, then going through rehabilitation and reintegration processes, and hopefully able to keep them within the communities, and at times spend a fair amount of time of preparing the communities for the return of these child soldiers who have probably killed or injured people of that same community previously as they were forcibly recruited, drugged up, indoctrinated, and ultimately threatened with their life. And so we have seen a lot of money and a lot of effort going into picking up the pieces after. In 2004, as a result of my personal experience in the field, both in Rwanda, where I had an AK-47 rammed up one of my nostrils with a 12 or 13-year-old with eyes that big, sweating, with a whole bunch of other his buddies at that barrier screaming and yelling and telling him to pull the trigger, and his finger was on that trigger. And the only reason still today that I believe he didn't pull it, either nervousness or whatever, was the fact that he saw the chocolate bar in my hand. And so, having seen the child soldiers in the field, and that they're still in the field, and picking up the pieces afterwards, the question is how are we resolving this thing? And although a lot of effort in the UN of shaming countries, of naming countries, of bringing people to the International Criminal Court, we haven't seen the numbers go down. So when I did my research at the Kennedy School, I worked on the premise that what if we treat the child soldier as a weapon system? What if we look at the recruitment of them? Why are they recruited? And how do we attenuate that? And by the by, how do we neutralize them so that they become a liability for the adults who want to use them? And in so doing, do it without killing them. For right now, in all the doctrines of the militaries of the world regarding the facing child soldiers, only the U.S. Marines have a small statement that says, try to avoid confrontation. Because a child soldier in combat is deemed to be simply a combatant, and under the law of self-defense and application of the rules of engagement, you are authorized to use deadly force. The question is how many of these kids can you blow away before when you get home you have a problem looking at your own children? And so is there another way of neutralizing them without killing them? Can we introduce non-lethal weapons? Are there means of getting at them to extract them? Are there means of getting at the adults without ultimately killing them? In extremis, yes. Contrary to many of the rights-based NGOs, my work has been one of looking at them with a weapon system, and two, in extremis, there may be some children that will be facing lethal force because they have become so fanatical and so drugged up and their brains so fried that there's no way of getting at them or getting at the adults without going through them. So we're looking at the child soldier as a weapon system. And it is sophisticated end-to-end because 40% of child soldiers are girls. When I was in Sierra Leone in 2001, at the ebbing part of that war, which was essentially fought on all sides by children, I was extracting kids out of the rebel forces, and I could get 10 boys for every girl. Why? Because girls are more useful than boys. They're up front killing and maiming and getting engaged in the combat. In those male-dominated societies, they run all the logistics, the bivouacs, the camps, the foods, and also they're the sex slaves and bushwives of the adult leaders. So they are far more effective. The sin behind this crime against humanity of employing children is the fact that although the boys are rehabilitated and reintegrated, they've done their sort of warrior thing, girls, because they've been abused and often have a child or two, are shunned by their society. And so they are simply left out there to drift and to be abused and continuously. And that's the sin, because not only is it difficult to get at them, but their inherent cultural framework has created the fact that these girls, they actually feel guilty of having been abused. So imagine the road of having to try to rehabilitate and reintegrate those girls. So the child soldiers are, to me, a very sophisticated weapon system in over 30 conflicts in the world and are used extensively. And where I am most fearful is the link between child soldiers and child, of course, prostitution, but also the children who are being child labor, because they're also used in the extraction industry, I'll get to in a moment, and also the trafficking of children. In the conflict in Côte d'Ivoire, the bulk of the children used there came from Liberia and Sierra Leone. And they are a very precious resource because they're veteran child soldiers and they're very effective. And so re-recruitment is a serious problem in the whole process, because your child soldier leader at 15 going on 25 is a very, very effective weapon system. So we have a weapon system out there of mass destruction. The bulk of the killing in Rwanda was done by a militia that started up as a youth movement of a political party. And through the radio and through uniforms and weekends and the soccer games and all this sort of stuff, these kids were indoctrinated and ultimately trained and became the génocidaires. And so the bulk of the slaughter of 800,000 human beings by machete in Rwanda was done by people well under the age of 19. So this is not an insignificant exercise. It is quite a sophisticated element of conflict that goes on. The recent operation in Mali, where over 10,000 youth were hired, or at least forcibly recruited, the Mali and French forces are said to have probably created well over 1,000 casualties amongst child soldiers to achieve their aim. So we haven't broken that code, and that's what we're trying to work at. And I will go rapidly because time to the extraction industry. The extraction industry as an industry has its structures and its concern, its security concern particularly, but there's a whole sort of cottage industry, extraction industry out there where youths are used on a massive scale to go after gold and diamonds and so on. And so the movie Blood Diamonds, just like the movie Lord of War, are excellent pieces to educate us or to inform you on how these children are used and how polyvalent, how a variety of usage we can make with them. And in so doing, they become a great asset to the cottage industry extraction of these resources that are sold to the big outfits, and in fact, those resources make their way into our economies. Now, there's another side to that, and that is the side of the actual extraction industries and how they're creating security for their own structures. How do they not employ under 18 youth as part of their security forces? How, in fact, they are able to protect their sites with the community without ending up killing a bunch of the youth of that community? And how are these new generation of security companies that the extraction industry is looking more towards, as the NGO community has done, hiring these ex-military and ex-police, how are they handling child soldiers? Are they simply blowing these kids away, or are there other means? And so part of the work we're doing is educating and training military, police, prison guards on how to handle children who are used as weapons of war without using lethal force, and ultimately trying to prevent their recruitment. And so right now, we're in the midst of a 5-year program in Sierra Leone where the president has got us to retrain his army, retrain his police, retrain his prison guards, and also influence the education system in order to get into the curriculum and convince the children and the teachers and hopefully the parents on how children should not be recruited in order to fall into the trap that happened before. And so Canada has been very busy with, picking up the pieces. And the example that I'd like to end with is when I was Prime Minister Martin's envoy to Darfur in 2005, where child soldiers are used extensively on all sides, from the militia Janjaweed to the rebel forces to the Sudanese forces. There's absolutely nothing out there to handle the child soldiers in any way, shape, or form. And as such, they were considered combatants, and as such, they were simply destroyed. The girls were raped, and ultimately that conflict is still today ongoing, festering, and those kids are still being recruited and employed. So I will ebb right now, which is not what I want to do, but I have to do, and hopefully we can go a little farther in the discussion. I'm only thankful that for my presentation, I like using my iPad, but I got embarrassed once when all of a sudden I was Skyped during a presentation. Thank you very much.
I was just saying to the General, I think he'd be fine on Skype. He was fine right now. It's great to be here tonight. This issue that both General Dallaire and I are speaking on is one that carries with it a heavy conscience at times, but really a drive to find solutions. And that's, frankly, if there's one message, as we say these days, to take away, is that you have a role to play. And I say that because when you become informed of an issue that's as important as child soldiers, as important as femicide, as important as human security for people who are vulnerable, then I think it's evident as a Canadian that you have a role to do something. And hopefully throughout the discussion we'll talk about what you can do. We're laying out the problems and hopefully some solutions along the way. And I've been very fortunate to work with General Dallaire over the years. I was elected in 2006, and he recruited me. And that was to put together a group for the prevention of genocide and mass atrocities, which you referred to. And the interesting thing about that was that there was no money for this organization. There was absolutely no staff, but an idea. And I came out of the teaching business, and so I was used to that. We quickly got to work with colleagues, and it was an all-party group, all parties coming together, Senate, House of Commons. And I'm really proud of the work that we've done together to expose some of the mass atrocities. And General Dallaire said it well, it was to inform our colleagues. And one of the issues we face as parliamentarians, I don't need to tell you, and I won't get cynical about it and talk about current affairs, but we're fighting ignorance often. And don't assume that the people who make laws, I know some of you know this well because you've studied the laws that are made, know what they're talking about. So it's very important, and an issue as important as mass atrocities, genocide prevention, that we actually have informed parliamentarians. And I've been really fortunate and delighted to have worked with General Dallaire. 4.5 years ago, I went to the Congo, and I was there to look at some of the programs and projects of the World Bank and how they were operating, if they were good, if they were substantive, if there improvements could be made. And I was so taken by the country. It's an extraordinary, beautiful country. It is, I mean, just the geography itself and the people, more so than even the geography. And but it's a place of beauty, but it's a place of absolute heartbreak for anyone who's been there. We've seen for a decade and a half government forces, rebel forces, and private militias really competing for control, in particular the east of the Congo. And when I went there, I spoke to government officials, and I wanted to look at what they were doing to confront the horrific violence, particularly in the east of the Congo. And you know, what were they doing to look for ways to create a sustainable economy, a peaceful country? And so I went right after the minister, one of the ministers involved with natural resources, and said to him, what are you doing about this horrific supply chain wherein militias are taking advantage of coltan that was already mentioned by General Dallaire, and making sure that these monies don't get to these horrific militias and the things that they're doing that we all know about. What are you doing about it? And he flipped the question immediately at me. He said, look, we do not have the capacity to oversee governance, to oversee proper regulations. And he said, what are you doing? And that really stuck with me. And he was right to question me, particularly as a Canadian, because as you know, our footprint is massive in terms of extractive industries around the world, Canadian companies, that is. And as General Dallaire also mentioned, we all carry a piece of the conflict with us. Because the coltan that, and just so you know, coltan it's a mix of minerals, but essentially it allows for your kid's PlayStation, your cell phone, your iPad, all the devices that were mentioned, make sure that they function, that they actually don't catch fire. It's a heat-resistant mineral, and you know, when we use these daily, we don't think about that, but each one of us is carrying a piece of the conflict with us. And unbeknownst to us, well, you now know it, but it was something that grabbed me because I thought, okay, well, if we can actually understand the supply chain, then clearly there's something we can do to ensure that we're going to stop the sale of these minerals to aid and abet these militias. So I took that question with me and took it back here to Canada and talked to a number of people who are working on this issue. But we need to understand what's going on in the Congo, and for many of you already know the statistics, but I think it bears repeating. Since 1998, armed conflict in the Democratic Republic of the Congo has killed 5.4 million people. Now, when King Leopold II was pillaging the Belgian Congo, as they called it, he was responsible for 10 million deaths. This is 2013, and we're clocking in at 5.4 million deaths since 1998. It's hard to conceptualize. And when I was in the States recently and I was invited to LA to speak on this issue, I said, think of all of LA and Manhattan wiped out. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about the war that's been going on since 1998. In 2011, the number of rapes was estimated at 48. Not per year, not per month, not per day, but 48 rapes per hour. In 2012, there were 2.2 million internally displaced persons, people who live in the boundaries of their country, but they cannot live in their communities because of this conflict. Conflict minerals generate some $180 million per year for armed groups, literally keeping these militias going. Many, up to 40% of those working in the mines are children. These children are exploited, they're abused, they're recruited as soldiers, and they're the prime targets for these armed groups. And of course, as you probably have already heard, Rape is not an outcome of war. Rape is a strategy and a weapon of war. The lack of public awareness on the issue is for some unbelievable. And it causes great concern and anguish at times when you think, why aren't people doing something about it? But for me, it's actually, there's a bit of hope here, because when people actually hear about what's going on, and they understand that there's something that can be done, they act. And people have been doing that. And I think once someone is personally connected to an issue, where the issue is humanized, where people see it's another human being that is being affected, and they understand that it could be their son, their daughter, mother or father, someone else in our human family, that they are then compelled to act and do something. Since my time in the Congo, I have made it a personal priority to, as a role as a legislator, we all have our roles to play, to do something to bring in legislation to deal with this issue of conflict minerals. Last March, I introduced the Conflict Minerals Act. It's Bill C-486. And the drafting process was comprehensive. I actually brought in people who were working on this issue from civil society, from industry. I reached out to people in the States who had been working on this issue, a group called the Enough Project. And if you go home, Google Enough Project, and there's some terrific information on there, their website. And the bill that I introduced was basically to have Canadian companies comply with what is already the case in law in the United States through the Dodd-Frank initiative, to force Canadian companies to identify their supply chain, to make sure their supply chain is conflict-free. It's that simple. Just like we did with blood diamonds, we need to do with conflict minerals. So we turn off the revenue streams for these militias. Is it going to solve all the problems of the Congo? Of course not. But it's one of the things that we should be dealing with, the source of the revenues for these militias. It was just this past August, I mentioned the Dodd-Frank initiative, the American Securities Exchange Commission announced new rules requiring American companies to demonstrate due diligence to ensure that their supply chain is clean. All of the main tech companies, from BlackBerry to Microsoft, Apple to Nokia, are taking steps to reduce conflict minerals in their supply chain. Good news. But more needs to be done. We need to have regulations here in Canada. My legislation is actually based on the OECD guidelines. And it's important to note that this was something I did in consultation with industry, because I think when you actually talk to people in this industry about it, they understand that they have a role. And I think we need to bring them in to hold them responsible, obviously, but to get them on board. No one wants to be tinged with providing support or revenues for these militias, obviously. So basically, the Canadian law that I've put forward asks that all companies comply with identifying their supply chain. I went a step further, and this was from the terrific work that different groups are involved on the ground in the Congo suggested to me, is to go a bit further than the Dodd-Franks. And not only would we have the Canadian legislation require that companies publish their supply chain, but we would make that available to countries in the region. And this is an important link, because it's not just about our country itemizing and enforcing, compliance and supply. It's sharing that information with those countries who are involved. The new OECD guidelines that I based my legislation on are actually guidelines that have been adopted by both Rwanda and Congo. Now, the General and I can talk about the ability and the desire of those countries to actually implement fully. But if you give them the information and you show the supply chain, then it forces them to act as well. And so that's an important distinction between what we had first brought forward as legislation, and because of my consultation with civil society, particularly a group called Partnership Africa, we've made that change and tweaked it. So if you look at what this is about, is obviously about accountability. It's about consumers' rights as well. The right of consumers to know, the right to know what's in the products that they buy. And when I talk to young people, they get this. You just have to talk to them about what recently happened in Bangladesh, the Joe Fresh example. When kids saw what happened there, they're starting to demand of their parents and of companies to change the way things are being done. That's the same with conflict minerals. Once people have the information, then it's not just about governments passing law. It's about consumers and citizens taking it on and participating as well. That's very important because, as we know, both child labor, gender violence, two of the most horrific things that we're facing right now globally, require not just politicians to make speeches and pass laws. You have to have vigilance. And to have vigilance, you know as lawyers, you have to have information to push compliance. And so this is also about a campaign to inform people about the issue, about the law, and about their role. And that's why I'm delighted to partner with many different groups on this, including General Dallaire's group, who are dealing with the issue of child soldiers. I also believe that it's an issue that we can actually get past the partisan games, that when you put this issue in front of any legislator and say, look, we can pass this law, we can ensure that we're bringing Canadian standards up to the standards of the US and the OECD countries. I actually believe that making the case to my colleagues across the way that we can work on this together. We've done this before. Blood diamonds is the case. The Kimberley process was very much a nonpartisan or multi-partisan project and very implicated in terms of the contributions of Canada. The illegal trade in diamonds was providing substantial funding to warlords and rebels in Africa throughout the 1990s. Separate and joint meetings of diamond-producing countries, international organizations, global civil society, and extractive companies led to the Kimberley process for certifying what they called rough diamonds. We can do the same thing with conflict minerals. We have the technology, we have the approaches. So today, the KP members, the Kimberley process members, account for nearly all of the global production of rough diamonds. Illegal exports are largely prevented, and legal trade is fostered by the increased consumer confidence provided by certification. In turn, legal and responsible trade contributes directly to sustainable economic and social development. In other words, if we tackle the whole issue of conflict minerals, it's not about boycotting the Congo, it's not about capital divestment of the Congo, it's about investment and sustainable development to benefit the people who have suffered through this conflict. I think we have another window of hope here as well, not just what's happening globally, not that this issue has been taken up by so many in civil society. It's because we've also recently seen, and I say this as a staunch New Democrat, I bleed orange, that we saw at the G8 a conservative prime minister bring forward this issue at the G8 when Prime Minister Cameron put on the agenda transparency. It was about what's happening in the extractive industries. And we actually had our Prime Minister sign on to the communique. Now, you and I know communiques are communiques. They have to be put into law and regulation. But it's a window of opportunity, it's a window of hope to push the issue to have compliance in the area of the extractive industries to make sure that no Canadian company is contributing to conflict. Let me finish with the following. 4 years ago, I went to the Congo to evaluate programs of development. I came away with, as I said, a heavy heart, but also a determination that our country, at its best, is there to solve problems and to work with others to make a better world. We all are implicated in this issue. Every single one of us has the capability to do something about people far, far away from us. Why? Because you're educated. You are knowledgeable, and you have power. And as Canadians, I think it's time we use our power for the good, and in this case, to prevent conflict and to prevent violence. Thank you very much.
So at this stage, I'm going to moderate a conversation briefly with our two speakers. I want you to know that I'm not the one who told General Dallaire to be brief. I could have listened to him all night, but we did have to hear from Mr. Dewar, and I'm glad we did, because both of you have provided us with really moving and thought-provoking and, I think, frankly, inspiring remarks. The last thing you want to do is hear from me, but I'm going to kick this off George Stroumboulopoulos-like up here, and ask each of them a couple of questions, and then I'd certainly like to open it up to the floor, because I'm sure many of you will have questions as well. So we have about a half an hour left to have that conversation. And maybe, General Dallaire, I could start with you. You mentioned to me when we were chatting beforehand about the intersection of child soldiers, child labor. You also mentioned, interestingly, child piracy, and that apparently 1/3 of pirates off the coast of Africa are children, and that we know that because when they do get arrested and detained and then released, they often go back. And I guess that's a segue to my question. I wonder if you could elaborate a little more on what your initiative actually does in training and education. You mentioned the successes I think you're having in West Africa and Sierra Leone and Liberia. But what about all those less organized places? What about the non-governmental use of child soldiers, and what your organization is doing to educate and train and solve this problem?
The University of Dalhousie has a very strong link to the Maritimes, of course, the maritime dimension, and it's close to the Canadian Navy, which has its Atlantic Fleet in Halifax. And so we are a center inside of the humanities faculty and the old strategic studies sort of department. And as we were doing our work, we were starting to hear more and more of the arrests of pirates. And that the JAG branch, the Judge Advocate General branch, that's of course part of the military, onboard ships were having problems trying to handle these pirates. I mean, where do you dump them off? What is the international law in regards to piracy? And are they doing absolute piracy activities as per the old definition, or are they doing other activities that we're using as piracy? And who's going to take them in? Who's going to set up the courts and the like? And so there was a lot of discussion going on. So a small part of our team who's been engaged with child soldiers, so conflict on land, was looking at the piracy and discovered that 1/3, not order, of magnitude of all pirates on the east coast of Africa are well under 18. And so we said, how are you handling child pirates? It had not been touched upon. This is as new as less than 2 years. What they've been doing was simply blowing them out of the water like anybody else. You might have remembered the SEALs that took out 4 pirates in a skiff when they took the captain of a ship, and they were about to kill the captain, and these Navy SEALs, American Navy SEALs, took out the 4 pirates. Well, 3 of the 4 were 15 and 14. So how do you handle them? Then when they arrived on shore, adults is one thing, but how do you handle youths in countries where they don't have a juvenile court? And should it be a criminal court, a juvenile court? And so they've just been dumping them on shore. And they've been dumping them in Kenya, and Kenya was trying to figure out what to do with them. And so they were simply flung back into the mill of getting them back into Somalia, and Somalia simply re-recruited them, and so they're in that cycle. So what is of significance is that these child pirates are also used in child banditry. They're used as child soldiers beyond Somalia, and they're an extraordinary resource. They're very polyvalent. I mean, they can be used in all these different tasks. If there's war going on, they'll use it for war. If there's banditry going on, it's piracy. And the skill sets are quite extraordinary, and they become very effective. And so how do we handle them has been the bane. UNICEF has been looking at the problem, and so one of the problems that we discovered was that everybody's looking at the child pirates once they're on the water, except the recruitment's done on land. So what are you doing on land? And there was nothing. And so we have now commenced operating through Kenya still, into Somalia to look at how that recruitment can be curtailed. And one of the interesting dimensions of that is the organizations that are recruiting these child pirates who are doing the piracy are not even in Somalia, they're in Kenya and elsewhere. So part of the problem is how do you get at them for recruiting child pirates, who were essentially, originally, simply children caught up with their parents fishing. But that whole industry has been lost. Now, on the west coast of Africa, they picked up on it. And so child piracy, not only piracy, but child piracy, is now off the scale. Because what they're doing is not just the ships, which is mostly on the east coast. They're after the diamonds, they're after the precious woods, they're after gold, they're after drugs that are moving along the coast, moving up the west coast of Africa, and often Mauritania is a reference point, but really they're moving through Western Africa and into Europe and the distribution. So we are now working in Sierra Leone, we've got mandated, but on the west coast we're trying to crack into the recruitment process first of all. Secondly, we were at Case University in Cleveland that had an international conference, legal conference on the rule of law and law of armed conflict, humanitarian law, and law of the sea. And see how do all these things get together so that they stop tripping over each other and actually get some stuff done. So that's ongoing. And the third part of it is that what happens when all those navies disappear? When we pull our Navy out because they say child piracy or piracy is ebbing, piracy is only ebbing because it's too difficult. So they simply pull back. And when the navies, which cost us an arm and a leg, out there, they pull back, then that will reestablish itself. And the fear is that the companies, the shipping companies are now hiring all these security companies. They're arming people on their ships, and these guys are just blowing anything that comes close to them away. So we're cracking the code by trying to get into Somalia and looking at it, and I'll finish with that, my short answer, by remembering that child soldiers, child piracy, is not a social economic problem. It's a security problem. It requires a security priority of effort and energy and resources. And what part of the solutioning of that is to bring in social economic solutions. But the problem is one of security.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Dewar, you sounded optimistic at the end about Canada's role and optimistic for your legislation. Mm-hmm. I was interested to hear of the initiatives of the United States, even the SEC in the United States. Can you elaborate a little more on what's happening internationally and
Sure.
why you feel that optimism? Is it Canada's bound to follow now? Is that what's
Exactly. Well,
happening?
maybe it's because I don't think we have any choice, but I'm optimistic because of all the work that has been done in the States and in Europe. Just to let people know, a couple of years ago there was a massive piece of legislation after the economic crisis in the United States called the Dodd-Frank Initiative. And what was adopted as it relates to conflict minerals is what I mentioned in my speech, is that there is now regulation that requires all American companies to identify their supply chain, and if they don't, if they're not compliant, then they have the hammer in the toolkit of the SEC. In other words, that they could go as far as delisting companies who aren't compliant. Now, that sounds good. There's a lot of bumps along the road, and if those of you who have been following Dodd-Frank's, this part of Dodd-Frank's will know that, you know, of course, you have to come up with the regulatory framework. You have to look at, you know, the compliance timetable, how long will it take companies. It's a massive piece of work. When I was in Los Angeles this past month in August, what was fascinating was that I was the only politician there sharing with them what's happening in Canada, but they were all talking about how they were implementing this initiative. And at the OECD, these guidelines are you know, in front of all who are members of the OECD, and people are looking at adopting them as well. So I'm positive because I can see the winds of change happening. I can see that, you know, a market as large as the United States has moved to implementation. And one final thing I want to mention about this, and I said it's not about, you know, boycotting the Congo or talking about divestment of the Congo. Goodness knows they don't need that. And there were some concerns when Dodd-Frank's was initially looked at, that people were saying, okay, if that's it, pull up stakes out of the Congo. This is too difficult, too much regulation, too many concerns. But there are positive things being done on that side of the equation. In other words, what we need to be looking at is what are the alternatives to these militias? And that is the next step. And there's a group I mentioned in my speech called Partnership Africa, and there's other groups who are actually going on the ground and recruiting people to work in a sustainable way and in recruitment of workers to bag and tag a clean supply chain. In other words, provide the alternative. And that's extraordinarily important. And again, Canada can play a very positive role in this because we already have people who are involved in this. Sadly, Partnership Africa, who was receiving money from the Canadian government, recently had its funding cut. But good news for them, bad news for Canada's reputation. Someone else picked them up. And so Europeans and Americans are helping out. So they're still doing their good work. And that's why I'm optimistic. And when you talk to people about what can be done, they get it. And as I said, kids get this issue. Adults have to get this issue. And you know, we really can show the world that we're serious about playing a constructive role by bringing in legislation, but also providing the alternative. And that's why I think it's so important to not just look at regulation of the supply chain, but also provide that alternative and making sure there's a clean supply chain where people are going to be treated with dignity, obviously.
Maybe,
I wonder
go ahead.
and to follow and reinforce what Mr. Dewar was saying, you probably remember when Darfur was hitting its stride, that there was a great harush about talisman in Sudan, in the eastern part of Sudan. In particular, not because it was linking in so much with Darfur, it was locked into the fight between Sudan and South Sudan, and that separation, which was going on also at the same time. And so there was a lot of pressure put on Talisman because it didn't have any notion of corporate social responsibility whatsoever. I mean, it was, the idea was not even coined yet, but it was engaged. Yeah, it built the odd school and things like this, but a lot of the money and so on for its oil extraction was going into providing funds to buy weapons from the Chinese to actually do the fighting against the South Sudanese and ultimately in Darfur. So Talisman packed it in. They sold. Their solution was, you know, hey, listen, we can't handle this bad press and it's ineffective. They also had, if you remember at the time, the Students Against Stand, which was for the students for Darfur, if you remember, and I was there at the launch in the States, and Canadian students were heavily engaged in naming and shaming companies and so on, so they were on their backs also. So they sold off to somebody else. Problem is, the person they sold to is worse than them. So the question is how do you handle that? I mean, was the solution to pull out our industry and create far more havoc and irresponsible actions by countries that have maybe a different perspective in regards to their ethical and moral responsibilities internationally and the rule of law? Or do we try to influence our own industry? And if we were just a little bit player, we're not. Mr. Dewar said it. We are one of the world major players in the extraction industry. We lead. Problem is, we're not necessarily leading also in the solutions of that, and it's starting to come about. But the worst scenario that could happen is we start pulling our support to those companies because they're not moving fast enough, instead of trying to assist them and hold them accountable and push the yardsticks in order to make that more effective in regards to their social corporate responsibility.
So maybe I can ask Mr. Dewar, just picking up on that, you mentioned in the States the SEC has a bit of a hammer. You've got legislation that's really a form of shaming, of listing those who are not complying. What is the reaction, or what do you anticipate the reaction will be from corporate Canada, from all of our great big mining companies that dominate the world?
It's interesting because when I opened up to them to look at the legislation to get their feedback, they weren't going to go and be champions for it, let me be clear, but they also were not going to oppose it to the extent that you might think, and simply because they understand that for their own brand, if you will, reputation, if you will, that there's nothing in it for them to be seen as being against this kind of approach in terms of identifying supply chain. And in fact, some of the representatives of the umbrella groups that represent some of the mining companies said to me directly, as long as we can look as being part of this and being a positive thing, we're actually okay with this. And that's a big change from 5 years ago even, where it was seen as anything that was going to put more onus on them through regulatory framework of any kind was seen as something that should be opposed. So things are changing. And the other thing that's really important about this approach, it's at the end use. So it's when those products are on sale. So it, if you will, puts the focus on the tech companies primarily. And to that, the tech companies are having to get in the program because, frankly speaking, it's activists who have started to list the companies who are most compliant. And as I said, the Enough Project in the States is doing a great job of this. And consumers are demanding, citizens are demanding that electronic companies do the same. And it was a 15-year-old, a 13-year-old kid in Canada who brought the issue of child labor up. And we all know who he is, Craig Kielburger. And that changed how we view child labor. And that's a really important example, and I say that to young people all the time. You might not be able to vote, but you can influence policy, and he's a great example of that. And so, the kids who are buying their latest tech device should be going to the store and saying, okay, what are you doing about conflict minerals? You might get a head scratch initially, but more and more people are doing that, kids doing that. You're darn right it'll be brought up in the boardrooms.
And how are we seeing it with the BlackBerries and Nokias and Samsungs of the world?
Well, we had a representative from BlackBerry at our consultation and was understanding that this is something they have to get on board with. So a big change there. And I think that as a country, we should have embedded in our foreign policy is corporate social responsibility. Look, we have trade missions all over the world. And that's to do things like, engage with investors to invest in Canadian companies. Fine. But let's look at the other side of the coin as well. And let's look at, compliance with basic norms that we demand of Canadian companies here in our own country. Let's start seeing that as part of what we do abroad as well. And so I think if I could influence my friend John Baird, one thing I'd say is to embed CSR as part of our foreign policy. Why not? And brand Canada as a CSR champion. I think it would be great for our country's reputation, but also for companies. So companies are getting this, they're understanding it. And in many cases, some of them are ahead of governments in terms of what they're initially thinking about doing and what some of them actually are doing.
Okay. There's a win-win out there. When you look at, as an example, Canada approaching the third dominant diamond-producing country in the world. And a lot of the diamonds are mines that are going up, are mines from De Beers and so on, who are already around the world very much engaged. And so when you go to consider buying your better half a diamond, there's an argument to be said, first of all, I'm going to buy a Canadian diamond because we are holding them accountable in an extensive fashion, and we are introducing the CSR more and more to them, particularly in the north where there's problematics with our Aboriginal people and so on. So the standards are being imposed there. And if we buy Canadian diamonds and they can show that they're meeting a significant standard here, then they can win us over to assist them in establishing those standards over there, in which then they won't be using child labor, they won't be using child protection forces or child soldiers, and ultimately those diamonds will no more be even considered blood diamonds. Well, there's a variety of minerals that are in that ilk where a lot of the work is here and the same outfits are over there. It's just a matter of moving that standard over there, and I think we could have them see the win-win in wanting to do that.
Great. It's so interesting. Many of you have probably heard Justice Abella speak about the failure of the disappointments of international human rights law over the past 60 years, and contrast it with the relative successes of international economic cooperation in, say, the last 20 years. And it's interesting how we can now lever economic laws and economic norms to achieve human rights ends. But so thank you for that. I'd like to open it up now. There are at least 3 microphones for those of you in the audience who'd like to have ask a question of our panelists. And if you do have a question, come forward. Just ask you to please just state your name and go ahead. Yes.
Do that or we'll threaten you with another 15-minute speech.
This question is for General Dallaire. My name is Michelle Power, and you've seen a lot of ugly situations in the world, and there's a lot of hatred, for instance, in the DRC with, just lack of respect for hatred between people, for women, between people that are adults. How do you go about stepping in there and educating them about how it's wrong, how they're treating or using their children when they don't even respect themselves as adults?
I was in the eastern Congo in Kivu and in northern Congo in the Ituri area. I was in South Sudan and also Central African Republic last April with the film crew with the White Pines, the same gang that went into Rwanda with me 10 years ago. And we were in there going after child soldiers, extracting them, meeting with leaders, and in order to bring forward that sort of argument of how can we stabilize the situation from a security sense, but also simply by bringing in the sort of rule of law, come respect of the population. And so the first thing we realized, and many have already, and as we worked our way in, is the problem is that there's no governance in that area. So, I mean, the Wild West is nothing compared to there. And nothing that much has changed because the governors who were there in '94 when I was negotiating with all the refugees in Goma and that whole Kivu area, they were very similar to the ones that are there now with Swiss bank accounts and all this kind of stuff. So there's no system of governance there to give reference to people. So that was the first problem. The second problem is that the place is running wild with different ethnic, tribal groups that are being either manipulated by others or simply trying to make their own position known. When I was there in April, the M23 launched its offensive against the government forces, and they were integrated into the government forces. They just decided one day that they weren't making what they thought they were going to make, and so they pulled out and started to use force against their colleagues. Well, when they did that, you'd say, okay, well, the army should resolve it. But the army is not paid. the Army is not equipped, the officer corps is not trained, and so there's no skill set there and no incentive for whatever security forces are there to assist. And there's no police to start. So what then you do in that sort of anarchy scenario where all these groups are going at each other's throats and using modern Civil War tools? One of the most effective modern Civil War tool has been alluded to by Mr. Dewar, and that is rape. Rape is one of the primary instruments of war right now. And finally, the International Criminal Court has recognized it as torture and has made it now a crime against humanity, finally. So massive rapes going on, massive abuse of weaponry, there's lots of it, and all these different groups. So how do you get the first space? So the international community's solution was, on the one hand, hoping the NGO world would come in, but it's so insecure they can't function effectively. So we send in a large UN force. And we'll say the UN force is there to create an atmosphere of security so that people can start sitting down. We can start building some courthouses. We can start, bringing some judges in and get the judicial process going, start training the police, and start, in fact, monitoring the people who are recruiting child soldiers and all that kind of stuff. That failed miserably. Although you've got nearly 30,000 troops on the ground, you need to just handle East Africa probably about 150,000. And you also need troops who can handle the complexities and ambiguities of civil wars. This is not just standing there and the guy's dressed differently, and if he is, you blow him away and you win. This is civil wars. And there's nothing more horrific than civil wars. Who sometimes will be the most nasty to you? Is it someone you don't know? Somebody at work? Or maybe a member of the family who knows you just too well and can cut right down. And so civil wars are ruthless. And so you need a set of tools by those forces that they do have ethical and moral references. They will operate legally, and they will be equipped and trained to be able to handle these conflicting scenarios in which they are facing. Well, we're not doing that. Not only we're not sitting in Security Council, but right now the international community through the UN has got over 100,000 peacekeepers. There are 43 Canadians. 43 Canadians are in peacekeeping. All the developed countries have pulled out of peacekeeping to play in other games, safer through NATO, which has good command and control and good sort of coordination and so on, and has divested, has Pontius Pilated peacekeeping in the most complex and ambiguous time frame to developing countries who don't have the equipment, don't have the training, don't have the skill sets, and can't sustain themselves in the field to take on these very demanding jobs. And so what we're seeing is that people are managing the problem. Not solving it, just managing it. And they've not been doing very well. And that's a bit of an indictment to us. Because we in the past have brought innovative solutions and have been leaders. In fact, in 2002, at the same time we were looking at sending troops into Afghanistan, which I agreed with. It's a nascent democracy that was looking for rule of law, good governance, human rights, gender equality, building its own sort of fundamental infrastructure of a nation. Of course it needed help. But at the same time, the Security Council turned to Canada and said, we need a 3-star general and we need about 2,000 Canadian troops to be the backbone of the biggest UN mission yet in the most complex situation yet, which is the Eastern Congo, which often is the resultant of our failure in Rwanda to start with. And we said no. And one of the arguments was we didn't have enough to do both jobs. Well, in 1992, when I commanded my brigade of 5,200, I had 3,700 deployed at any one time. Now we can't keep 2,000 in the field. Why is that? Why have we divested ourselves of capabilities of doing things versus continuing to lead and be prepared as a leading middle power in the world mastery technology, hard work ethic, belief in human rights, has no ambition to subjugate anybody else, considered a neutral free player, respected. Why haven't we built the capacity to be able to intervene, to separate, to assist? That's a decision that's been taken by Ottawa, and the rest of the country has watched it. Oh, defense is expensive. Not if defense is aimed at protecting and preventing mass atrocities and massive abuses of human rights that will hit our shores. Just look at this town and what the Tamils did when they didn't like what was going on back home. So the diasporas are sometimes dragged in to these problems over there. And so there's no way of separating ourselves. It's in our interest to invest more appropriately this way. Okay. That's my short answer on that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, at the other microphone.
Yes, my name is Yamri Taddese. I'm a reporter with Law Times. My question is about the role of lawyers, particularly general counsel who work with Canadian mining companies in promoting accountability and ultimately helping curtail these conflict minerals.
Well, I just start with the role is to ensure that companies are going to be compliant with basic norms that we force companies to comply with here in Canada. I think that we should be looking at lawyers counseling and advising mining companies to say, look, you know, the norms that you have here in Canada should be applied elsewhere. A very simple principle. And should be advocating for processes that help with that. And there was, 3 years ago, an initiative in front of Parliament to have an ombudsman created to oversee Canadian companies' mining activities, extractive industries writ large, actually, overseas. And if there were concerns or complaints from the countries where where Canadian mining companies were involved, that there would be a process for people to bring those issues forward to an ombudsperson. And the government, instead of creating that position, which there was agreement amongst most parties, they brought in a counselor, wherein if there was a concern brought forward, the counselor would take that concern, but not follow up unless there was an agreement from the mining company to go forward. Well, you can guess what happens, right? So that's been a failure. And so I would suggest that lawyers have a very important role here. One is to say to mining companies, it's in your best self-interest, as well as, if you will, moral interest, to pursue these kinds of regulatory frameworks that allow for oversight to the conduct of Canadian companies abroad. And as I mentioned, some companies are on board with this and they're going forward. But I think, frankly, it's the role of the government to do this. And I'm clearly, lawyers can be agents of that, and they should be.
Okay.
It was Bill C-298 that you introduced.
Yeah. Yes.
And what happened? It got shot down?
Well, there was another bill, C-300, and it got shot down before mine got anywhere. So, but that's another story.
We're having a bit of a problem with that.
We are.
Right. Okay. A couple of parliamentarians here. So we have two more people with questions, and then we'll probably be out of time. So go ahead. Here.
You mentioned that there's a couple different ways of dealing with child soldiers in terms of sometimes actively trying to remove child soldiers from the battlefield has an inherent risk, obviously, of killing some of those child soldiers. But at the same time, the NGOs are sometimes dealing with them too far after the fact. It's waiting for them, the child soldiers, to come to the NGOs, something which they don't necessarily have a choice in doing so a lot of the time. It requires a lot of danger escaping from these warlords. So I guess my question is, do you believe that we should be taking a more active role in removing child soldiers from these conflict zones, and what form that should take, be it military action or legislation, and those sorts of things?
That's a very fine question, because you're going to the root of the problem is, you know, how do we get this weapon system out of the inventory? If it was a tank we'd find anti-tank systems, and we've got all kinds of technology to do that, and we'd simply limit that way. But if it's a child soldier who's engaged through the whole spectrum of what the conflict is going, and I mean, how do you neutralize that capability? And so we looked at it in the dimension of, one, how do we prevent them from being recruited? That is, cut off the source. We don't seem to be able to cut off the source of the weapons. The proliferation of small arms, recently there was a convention on small arms that was signed last March.
Not by Canada yet, so
We
call your MP.
We agreed on the table, but then when we were waiting for it in the Senate, it was told, well, it's being held up. And you said, well, why is it being held up? And he said, well, we've got interested bodies. But Canada introduced in that sort of convention a particular clause on hunting weapons that should not be considered part of that. And they won it. They actually won that. And it's in there. And then when it came to Canada to ratify it, we refused because we're still discussing with some of the duck hunters and so on. So you're going to wonder, you know, we're not worried about them, we're worried about these weapons in the hands of the kids. So one, if we can't stop the weapons, how do we stop the kids from being recruiting? And that's through, we've discovered through better education, better security of the families, avoiding the Gulu Walk exercise, if you remember, in northern Uganda with the LRA and so on. And so we've been working with the school systems and so on, particularly using Sierra Leone as our framework to educate that. But what about the kid who's actually now being used? Well, use of radio is massive. They find ways of always getting to a radio station. And so some of you are familiar with Invisible Children. You've seen, you know, they did that big affair on Coney last year or so on. I mean, I didn't necessarily like it because there were some significant errors in it. However, they've been picking up a lot of money, and we linked up with them in northern Congo, where they're running a whole series of radio stations. So they're surrounding the people who are using child soldiers with large numbers of radio stations, and they're emitting all the time how the kids can get out, where they should go, what do the Blue Berets do, you know, how to do it, when to do it, and so on. And there's no jamming capability, so the radios is a very important tool. The other mention is the use of ultimately non-lethal means of trying to extract them. And in so doing, we discovered that the police and the military are not even talking on how to work together in the community to get them out, exchange information. But the NGO community, even the development people, were not talking to the military because they needed their humanitarian space, their neutrality. And so that one is what we're trying to crack right now. The concept of neutrality by the NGO world, and I don't know if I'll offend Paul or not, but I've had big discussions always with James Obrinsky. We meet regularly. We got a big event going on at Dalhousie on the 10th of October, and we're on the podium together, and we're going to beat each other up again, where he feels that the neutrality humanitarian space is crucial to the NGOs being able to get in there and assist in attenuating the conflict. And I'm arguing that not providing extraordinary information and not working with the security forces, you're preventing them from being able to be effective. And my last example is that I testified in front of the International Criminal Court on Rwanda several times and provided a lot of information. But there was another guy who could have provided what I had plus some. And he was the International Red Cross representative.
Yeah, he couldn't.
And he was prevented from testifying. So there are some real bad guys out there who are not being stopped because of this concept of neutrality that I argue is of another era, and not of our era of these enormous, complex, and ambiguous scenarios in which we find ourselves in these civil wars.
Okay, thank you. One last question, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you.
My name is Benazir. I wonder if you could speak about what we can do to regulate Chinese companies that are now going into the Congo, for instance, to extract minerals. What can we do with a country like China, which is the next superpower, if not already the superpower? And what can we do with other superpowers, which are most likely going to do the same thing?
That's a great question, and Senator Dallaire was talking about this earlier about what happened with Talisman in Sudan. You know, if you just vacate, someone else is going to take your space, and that's what's happening. And two things that are extremely important here. One is that the Dodd-Frank's method and bringing citizens, consumers into the equation is absolutely vital, because it's not about just the mining company or those who are involved in the supply chain. It's at the end use, regardless of where that item is, you know, who is contributing to the making of that electronic device. In this case, you know, think about your BlackBerry or your smartphone. It goes from, you know, the minerals that are mixed in the supply chain. It goes somewhere in Asia to be put together, and then you buy it. Along the lines of what these, you know, OECD guidelines that will become law, hopefully in many countries, including our own, what's happening in the States, will force companies to follow that supply chain. So it won't matter who's at the source, they have to follow these guidelines. And it creates more accountability. The other issue we had years ago was that if it's just Canadian companies following these rules, well, so what? Someone else will, you know, jump in and do it differently and cheaper and less regulation. So therefore, we have to have something that's global and end use. And so that's the difference, so that there is a force on accountability regardless of who's involved, what country's involved, through this initiative of the OECD, the Dodd-Franks, because it's at the end, when you go buy your device, the company has to source the supply chain regardless of what country was involved in supplying, okay? The final point is just that we have to force the Chinese, and you're seeing more of it, be it on climate change or on issues of human rights, to take their place in, you know, global affairs. And let's just be frank about it, because they are superpowers now. They own most of the US's debt and others. So, you know, it's a matter of really pushing this diplomatically as well. And one final comment, I just want to tag on to the previous questions. Two things that I think are really important. The arms trade treaty that we have not signed. We helped, you know, there was negotiations, as General Dallaire said. We actually brought in people to, our civil society representative was someone who represented the gun lobby. That's just a fact. So that's what we're dealing with here. But even after their success in getting some provisions to protect hunters, we still have not signed it. So that's something you can do, is to push your MP to, you know, to say, I want the government to sign the ATT. And the other thing that's very important, the last point I'll make, is that there's a UN resolution that Canada was very involved in putting together and adopting at the UN, and that's UN Resolution 1325, and there's subsequent resolutions after that, after 1325, which is about the role of women in peace building, in post-conflict. We actually have a very good action plan on it, because we have very good diplomats and people who put it together. We need to be pushing that, because when we're talking about conflict, and the question that was asked before about how do you deal with it, women are agents of change all around the world, and we have to get our head around this notion that it's no longer relevant to just have men, quote, protecting women. Women have to be at the table. They have to be the ones who are going to be given the challenge of changing things. That means giving access to power. And that means that we have to change our whole way of thinking, and that means innovations on peacekeeping and peace building. And that's why 1325, the UN resolution, is so important that we adopt and implement and make it part of our foreign policy.
Empowerment of women. You cannot prevent conflict unless you have a good reconciliatory process and nation-building process, because rarely will these conflicts start from scratch. They start from a lot of history. And just go to look at Yugoslavia and other places, they'll go back 400, 500, 600 years. So one of the fundamental instruments of reconciliation is introducing a whole new factor, and that's the factor of women, empowering of women. The guys are just too hung up in those male-dominated societies to handle it. And so education of the young, so you get a good intellectual rigor, which is not necessarily religious-based, but value-based, yes, but empowerment of women, crucial to that. Secondly, I am not going to be as diplomatic if my colleague, who's not known to be diplomatic either. I would argue that China is raping Africa worse than any of the colonial powers ever did. And it's doing it on a massive scale. And it's got some real interesting angles to it. I'll give you an example. It's now buying off resource-based capabilities in South America. But it's closing them down. It's buying them and closing them down, which is creating massive poverty and disconnects in a number of South American countries who are really going to have some serious problems because the Chinese are buying them for their reserves. They don't need it now. So they're raping Africa and they're holding back other places of the world in reserve. And there's nothing coming back to the nation. There's no capacity building, there's no transfer of technology. It is just take and take and take. And so there is, in my opinion, a world power out there that, yeah, we want to do business with them, but I really think that we are missing the boat massively in bringing them to task. If you want to play in the big leagues, well, we have rules. And because we're too wimpy to apply them, they're finding ways of getting around them. Well, it's up to us to sort that out.
Well put. On behalf of both CLAIHR and the Law Society, we thank our speakers profusely. Thank you so much, and we can continue this conversation with the reception that's being hosted by both the Law Society and Canadian Lawyers for International Human Rights. For those who require assistance getting upstairs, this is a fully accessible building, and just ask for some assistance and we can get you there as well. For those of you who would like to learn more, keep your brochures. It's got the website information for Roméo Dallaire's Child Soldier Initiative, for the Law Society of Upper Canada and its equity initiatives, as well as for the Canadian Lawyers for International Human Rights. In this conversation that we're going to continue, please feel free to approach some of the CLAIHR Board of Directors. Many of us are here tonight. If you can all just stand to make yourselves known briefly. And thank you once again, everyone, for coming, and we invite you to the reception.